Welcome, my friends, to Biblical Musings. I'm glad you decided to join us. We're going to take a look uh, at a story from the Bible of David when we first see him. The first time we get introduced to the character who will later become king of all Israel, King David himself, and the archetype for Jesus and many other things. Let's see how he began. I think there's an interesting lesson to learn from the very first time we get introduced to this character, David, this man of history, and to see what God says about this person and his choosing of him to be the future king of Israel, even though it won't happen for a very long time, that he will be the actual king, but of God's choosing that he will be the king. So let's set up some context, if you will, if you're not familiar with the story, and even if you are. Israel is having its first king, and it has its first king right now, and a man named King Saul. Now, Israel clamored for a king many years before, during the days of Samuel, their judge. You see, Israel was not ruled by kings. They were ruled directly by God, but they didn't really have a central form of government of any kind after they had conquered the promised land after the days of Joshua. What would happen is a national emergency or need would arise. An invader is coming. They've been conquered even already. And then God would raise up a hero for them, a judge, as it were, and he would lead them to victory in some way, small or great, or somewhere in the middle. And usually that person, not always, but usually that person for their life would kind of be the leader and judge who would kind of settle the big matters for the nation. They're not really a kingdom yet. Over a period of quite some time, this is the case. But the book of Judges ends with a very awful incident and indeed a civil war which completely obliterates the tribe of Benjamin to near extinction, to very near extinction. And the book basically ends saying that everyone is doing what's right in their own eyes, which is a very bad place to be on a national scale. Because in truth, some do good and justice and righteously, but most are doing only what pleases them and their selfish interests. And so you have all kinds of wickedness running rampant, and there's literally nothing to stop them. There's no authority, there's just nothing. And so that's not an optimal situation. And the people cry out for a king after a period of time. Samuel becomes a judge, and he's ruling, not really ruling, but he's guiding Israel well. He really is. He's a wise judge. And he's also one of the priests who serves at the tabernacle. But it's during his days, he's the last judge, that the people say, we want a king. We want a king. And Samuel sees this as the people deserting not really his authority and guidance as much as they're deserting God's. And God tells them the same thing. He says, they're not really rejecting you, Samuel. They're rejecting me because God is supposed to be their king. And they're not following him adequately or correctly, which is why they're having so many problems and lawlessness. But at the same time, they need rule. And they're not being ruled by anything. And so they cry for a king, and God gives them Saul. And Saul starts off great. He's humble. He seems to be likable. He's tall and strong and handsome. And he seems to do good. He leads Israel. He has victories. He's a young man. He seems to be what the people love. They love him. But then he starts to turn, as it will. Whether the power goes to his head or it's in his impatient nature, whatever it is, he starts doing what he wants without regard to what God instructs him to do. And he starts making many, many critical mistakes and selfish blunders and errors, all of his own choosing. And God ends up rejecting him. He doesn't remove him immediately, but he rejects him. And he tells him as much, saying, I've rejected you from being king anymore when the final straw happens. And that's in the previous chapter of the text where we're at. I'm just going to read the last couple of verses of chapter 15 of 1 Samuel. It says, Then Samuel went to Ramah But Saul, who was the king, went up to his house at Gibeah of Saul. And Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, for Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. And so that's where we're at. Samuel and Saul are no longer friends and companions or trusted advisor and king. Their relationship is completely broken. I encourage you to go back and read the other chapters. We don't really have time today, but and see what happened that would make such a situation. But God is at a place where he regrets that he's made Saul king over Israel. And Samuel is grieved. He's very grieved. But chapter 16 begins, and it begins like this. Now it says, "Now the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have selected a king for myself among his sons." But Samuel said, "How can I go? When Saul hears of it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. You shall invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me the one whom I designate to you." Hence, that's why he's taking the oil in a horn, to anoint the one God's choose, to consecrate them, set them apart. So Samuel did what the Lord said and came to Bethlehem, and the elders of the city came trembling to meet him and said, "Do you come in peace?" He said, "In peace I have come to sacrifice to the Lord." Samuel's a very important person, and go read the preceding chapters. He may seem like a kindly old man, and I think he is, even though I've never met him myself, but from reading about his works and stuff. But he has another side, if you will. He can be a vengeful carrier out of God's wrath and justice as well. And so people respect him. He's a good man. He's a good judge. But people respect him. And so he does come in peace. So I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. He also consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they entered, he looked at Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." Now this is Jesse's oldest son. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, "The Lord's not chosen this one either." Next Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." Thus Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen these." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Are these all the children?" And he said, "There remains yet the youngest. Behold, he's tending the sheep." Then Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down here until he comes." So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy or red, with a beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. And Samuel arose and went to Ramah. Now, it doesn't tell us much about David in this chapter, except that he's the youngest of 8 sons of Jesse the Bethlehemite. But just by saying that he's a son of Jesse doesn't necessarily make him important, but you do realize, if you've read earlier in the text and in some cases later, to get the history, that he comes from a lineage of people of faith, people who stepped out in faith, people who were known for their character more than their worldly possessions, as it were. He has some interesting lineage, to say the least. He has prostitutes in his lineage. Rahab the harlot is his ancestor of not too recent, and so is Ruth the Moabitess, the widow who travels to a foreign land with her mother-in-law, and by her trust in the Lord and her perseverance and her character alone recovers her fortunes, as it were. And so he comes from an interesting lineage. And the man who would marry Ruth, Boaz, is a man of strong character. Now, he was a man of some wealth as well. That doesn't make you a bad person, obviously. But he's a man of strong moral character, a godly man. And so Jesse and his sons come from a lineage of men and women of faith, even if they had some colorful backgrounds, as it were. But that's not enough to make a man or a woman. It's not enough to have the right lineage. Because Eliab, the firstborn, he's tall of stature, and he's good looking, and he's strong, and he's older than the rest of his brothers, and presumably wiser. And Samuel's like, man, that guy's king material. Just look at him. He's a king. That guy looks like he could be a king. He could lead Israel. That's the kind of man he looks like. He's tall. He's strong. He just looks the part. God said, that's not how I look for kings. Men look at the outside. Men look at the appearance. I look at the heart. That's where I look. I look inside at the thoughts, the will, the desires, the inclinations, the soul itself. I'm looking at what's inside that person. That's what I look at when I'm looking for a leader, when I'm looking for a man after my own heart. That word doesn't come up, or that phrase doesn't come up in this chapter, but it's going to be the main way that King David is described. He's a man after God's own heart. He's a man of courage. He's a man of action. He's a man of passion and compassion. He's a man of great joy. He's a man of faithfulness. He's a man who praises God. He's a man who weeps in despair, but comes out of it. Walks through the valley of the shadow of death, and comes out the other side still faithful to God. He's a man of many things. Now, does he slip up and mess up? Oh yeah, big times. Those are stories for other times, of course. But God looks at what's inside, and he sees that David is a man after his own heart. And that's what's most important. And so he says, he's the youngest, it doesn't matter. That's the one I want. There he is. That's the man I want to be king over all Israel. The youngest son of a small town sheep herding and maybe farming guy. That's the one I want. The youngest of the 8 sons. That's the man I want to be king over all my people. Well, what's the takeaway? To me, it's a simple story, and it's an encouraging story, because there's one lesson which stands out above all else. It's that God doesn't look at the outside. Now, I know that's painfully obvious, but just humor me for a moment, and let's think of the ramifications of that. Because the world tells us all the time, it just crams it in your face, whether you realize it or not, and you probably do realize it. But you may not think it's a bad thing. Tell me if you've ever heard this. You can be anything you want to be. Dream as big as you want. Reach for anything you want to do. If you want to do for it, just go for it. Set your mind to it, and you can achieve it. Now, is that true? I think we'd all like to think it was true. But it's not true to the nth degree. Now, there's certain aspects of that to be true. We've all heard the rags to riches stories, and they're very uplifting stories sometimes. And they're not all bad. Don't pull me out of context and misunderstand me. But just take me, for instance. I'm about 5'11", over 200 pounds. I'm never going to be a great basketball player. I don't have the genetics for it. I'm not tall enough. I'm not fast enough. I'm too fat. All those things. I have really poor hand-eye coordination. I can't jump worth nothing. I'm never going to be, even if I practiced from now on, and I've already started too late too, but if I had started practicing from a small child, every day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for years, I still wouldn't be able to be a pro basketball player with any likelihood of success, because I don't have the genes for it. I don't have the skill. I just don't have the height. Don't have a lot of things. And so it's not realistic for me, in any sense of the word, to dream of being a pro basketball player. Now, could I have enjoyed basketball? Sure. Could I play it and enjoy it? Absolutely. But if I spent my life going for a goal which was out of reach because of the way I'm made, I can't achieve everything I set my mind to. It's just not true. And there's many other examples that would also be true if you follow that line of thought. But think about this. God doesn't look on the outside. And so even if I'm blind and deaf and I have no legs, I can be a valuable asset in the kingdom of God. I can be a valuable instrument in the hands of God. I can do mighty things through Christ who strengthens me, because the outside body, sure, it has application to the world. I may not be able to do everything I set my mind to, but that's not really what matters, because the inside is what matters. That's what God looks at. That's where God finds value in people. That's where he finds value in you or me. And the good news is that can be changed. Now, I know circumstances affect it. I know your upbringing affects it. I know all of that does. But I believe firmly that God can work in any person to change their circumstance, to change their mind and their attitudes, to turn a heart of stone into a heart of gold, to soften the hardest hearts, to change into powerful workers, to powerful emissaries of God, into powerful, compassionate people. And you've heard those stories as well. And it's my belief that anyone can become great in the kingdom of God if they're willing to submit themselves to God's law, to follow him with all their heart, to trust in him, to change their heart, to change their minds, to fill him with their goodness and the Spirit. Because David, yeah, he's the one God chose because his heart was right. But he didn't go from being a shepherd boy to a king all in one day either. It was a long journey that God took him on before he finally sat on that throne. And even then, the journey wasn't over. He didn't arrive at any point in time. He struggled throughout his life to be a man after God's own heart. But it's what he was. So I want to encourage you, whatever age you are, whatever demographic you find yourself in, I don't think God cares nothing about any of that. I believe he's willing and able and wants, yearns for you to step out in faith, to seek him, to put your trust in him, to use you in his kingdom for his purposes. And I believe when you surrender yourself to God, heart, mind, soul, everything, that you will grow closer and be blessed in ways you cannot even imagine. And you, if you set your focus on being a man or a woman after God's own heart, I think you might be surprised the things God could do with you. Well, that's been my musings today on 1 Samuel 16. Just kind of a break. I know we've been kind of jumping around in the Psalms a little bit, and we may go back. I haven't decided yet. But here pretty quick, we're probably going to start another series. Something that will coincide with what we're doing probably on Wednesday nights here at the church. But until I get that done, we're probably going to do a little bit of hip fire, as it were, and kind of jump around and just muse a little bit on various passages, whatever's hitting me at the time or whatever I'm thinking about. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you would like to meditate a little bit and read back and see about Samuel and read forward a little bit about David and see how a man after God's own heart looks like. See how he acts. And I would encourage you to try and emulate that. Not to the same exact way that David did, perhaps, but in the same spirit of what David did, because he is a man after God's own heart. And that's his example all the way forward. What a powerful testimony. So I would encourage you, strive to be a man or woman after God's own heart above all else. And I believe you will be eternally blessed. This has been Biblical Musings. Thanks for watching.